everybody, to Movie Time, brand new show on Auburn Regional Media Access, where we're going to be talking about movies. I'm Mike Reiff.
And I'm Joe Salzone. It's good to have you with us.
Okay. Today we're going to be kicking off the series with the latest release from Marvel, from Disney, from Joss Whedon, Avengers 2. So Joe, when we think about the Avengers and Marvel, I think about my old days reading the comics, a lot of good times. But nowadays, these movies have turned into these corporate special effects laden behemoths. Some say light on characterization, some say light on coherent storytelling. But here's something to think about that I'll start us off with. Joss Whedon, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Cabin in the Woods, great movie. Astonishing X-Men comics. The man is everywhere. He's known for great characterization, great group dynamics, good female leads.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Do we see those hallmarks in this movie, or has Joss Whedon sort of been consumed by the beast?
I think a little of both, Mike. I think what's interesting about something like The Avengers 2, which is the sequel to the original, which came out in 2012, what's interesting is you take comic book characters that came out in, the 50s, the 60s, and they were just on pages, and now you have these blockbuster films that millions of dollars are spent to make them, and I have to be really honest, I was not impressed with the film.
It's too bad.
To be fair, I never saw the first one.
Right.
And I never read comic books growing up.
Right.
So the plot was, I didn't have a vested interest in the characters, but the plot was easy to follow, and it was the classic good versus evil tale, which you see, which really dominates comics and really film overall.
Okay, so not a win for you.
No, I wouldn't say it was 2 thumbs down. I would say I may have gone into it a little negatively because I don't really care for the genre.
Yeah.
So based on that, it was okay.
Right.
If they come out with a third one, I might be inclined to watch it on the internet for free.
Okay.
So I'm not going to spend any hard-earned money on it.
Interesting. Okay. So let's see. Let's think about this bit by bit.
Yeah.
Comic books, where they're coming from. So I grew up reading the comics. There was sort of a hectic dynamic to having 20 characters and 22 pages.
Yeah.
I feel like this movie does a pretty good job. There's some really interesting scenes in it where they're all hanging out at a party. I thought that was very strong because you've got Don Cheadle and Anthony Mackie and, of course, Chris Evans and all the other Avengers hanging out, having a good time. And I thought that was a nice way to show not superheroes at a party, but just normal people, group dynamic. And I feel like that's where Joss Whedon does well.
They were relatable in that scene.
Right.
It could have been us and a couple of our buddies together over some beers, just shooting the breeze.
But with hammers.
Well, of course.
And guns.
Obviously. One thing of note, the cast is impressive.
Yeah.
I mean, you have Robert Downey Jr., Scarlett Johansson, who's become a great superstar in the world of film. James Spader.
Right. As the voice of the robot. The evil robot.
I don't know if Joss Whedon had James Spader in mind for that role, but I couldn't think of a better person with a better voice for any role but that. I mean, that was brilliant casting. Samuel L. Jackson, who seems to be in every movie ever made since the 1920s.
Right.
I think he was in the silent films. He was in the first talkie.
Yeah.
He was brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean, there was no. A lot of these times with the ensemble cast, you have that kind of weak link. You don't have that in this one.
True. And we should probably pull back just a little bit and think about story. This is a film about the Avengers, and one of them, played by Robert Downey Jr., Iron Man, wants to pretty much have world peace.
Yeah, essentially.
He designs a whole bunch of robots that he thinks someday are going to be able to protect everybody, like drones, like the drone policy, right?
Right.
And then one somehow becomes very smart because of a cosmic gem, and that's all that nerdy stuff that sort of doesn't need to be explained.
Yeah.
But it comes alive and it thinks, well, the way to get peace on Earth is to wipe out all the humans. Starts out by saying,
good point.
I'll protect you at a cost, and by the end of the movie, somehow we're all going to get wiped out by a giant asteroid. I will say, I think that was pretty impressive. I was able to sum it up like that.
Yeah.
Because it's 2.5 hours.
Yeah, it's a long movie.
The first cut was 3.5 hours.
Yeah.
So there's about an hour missing, and it feels like that. But I will say it starts strong. For me, great characterization, great cast, James Spader's the robot's good. I will agree that by the end, it becomes a bit conventional. Still looks good. I like this sort of blue-white tone to all the images, sort of like Captain America 2, this stripped-down, toned-down palette. But it just becomes a floating island with a bunch of robots and superheroes, and that's fun. But I want it to go further, right? Dark Knight's my favorite of the superhero movies because it really makes you think. This one's fun, but am I going to see it again? Probably not for a while.
It's interesting because you went into watching it as a fan of the genre. You grew up with the comic book, so you had, going back to that term, a vested interest in the characters and the plot, and you were excited to go see it.
Yeah.
I didn't go into it with any kind of fandom, so I went in, blank slate, didn't really know the characters. I never saw Iron Man. I never saw any of those films. I vaguely understand, who the characters are. That being said, it's sophisticated. It's not a movie for children. It's not a kids movie.
I agree.
I mean, it's a lot of superhero films are targeted for that demographic. This is not. It is a sophisticated, dramatic film with elements of comedy, which is a staple, really, of Joss Whedon. And frankly, Robert Downey Jr. When was the last time he had a purely dramatic role? It's been a while.
Sure, Gothica.
What?
Yeah.
Did you just sneeze?
No, maybe.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I would recommend it to someone who, especially someone who likes that genre and likes the characters, and even someone who just wants to be entertained for a couple hours. I mean, the time goes by. It doesn't really drag at any point.
Sure.
Well, a little bit in the beginning, but that's typical of a movie. The time really does go by fast.
Yeah. So one knock these movies have gotten a lot, superhero movies, but action films in general, we're hitting into the action season.
Yeah.
Raw editing, too fast of editing, too complicated. I'm thinking, though, of a couple images. I think the first sequence where they're in a forest and each person gets a little moment to show off their power, but maybe a little off-center. So he's using the rule of thirds for dynamic compositions. And then at the end, there's a shot where they're fighting robots, but the camera swirls around them and we get to see each as a team in the same space. Those are good. But did you find maybe this movie moves a little too fast in some scenes? You have a big fight in the middle between Iron Man and Hulk, and it seems Johannesburg or Cape Town, a lot of people running and screaming. What did you think about the editing? I mean, this is sort of big budget filmmaking done right, visually?
I think so. I think the pacing was good for the entire film. There were some scenes where the action was, pardon the expression, fast and furious.
Right.
You had other scenes where it was kind of a slower paced, had a little more of that, dramatic tone. I thought the blend worked in this case. Sometimes you can have way too much of one and not enough of the other, and you have a movie that's kind of off balance. In this case, again, as someone who doesn't follow the genre, I've been using that word an awful lot. I thought it was well done from beginning to end.
Yeah, and of course he's writing and directing, and he hasn't directed that many films, so this is a big achievement. What about, though, getting back to that original question, Joss Whedon is balancing quite a few characters, and we get some minor characters from earlier films, the guy with the bow, Hawkeye, played by Jeremy Renner, from Hurt Locker, right? So he's a serious actor. He gets more screen time here, characterized with a family. But with this many, especially since you're coming to this as a novice, did you find that there was too many characters to juggle mentally, intellectually? Did he get a good balance?
I can't point to a specific example where all of a sudden you're just being barraged by characters. Even a novice like me was able to kind of figure out, okay, bad guy, good guy, bad guy, good guy. Could they have maybe eliminated a couple of the characters? Sure. People who were kind of on the peripheral, who didn't have any great impact on the ending. I guess we don't want to spoil the ending for those because it only came out a few weeks ago.
Right.
No, I mean, they could have done without one or two people, but it wouldn't. They could have subtracted one or two people without impacting anything.
Sure.
But I don't think those one or two people take anything away either. So I guess I'm sort of in the middle on that.
So what do you think this movie could have used a little bit of? Right. I'm thinking about Captain America 2. I don't know if you saw that.
No.
had this interesting layer of critique of the NSA. Wherever you fall on that, it's nice to see a movie grappling with this.
Yes.
And Iron Man movies in general think about the role of war profiteers. Tony Stark, through most of these early films, is building weapons, and they're ending up in the wrong people's hands, and he's wrestling with that guilt. I was a bit surprised at how a smart man like Joss Whedon didn't really do too much. Maybe that's the hour that got cut. With AI, which is certainly in the news a little bit. Ex Machina just came out. That's a good film that deals with it. But also issues of guilt, right? The robot comes out first and he says you're all killers, and they have to wrestle with that for the next 2 hours, are we?
Right.
The ethics of power. I mean, is there something that you felt was missing, something that could have added and fleshed it out?
There was enough contemporary issues, or at least brushed by a lot of contemporary issues. See, the problem with any kind of movie that talks about current events is in 20 years, you've already forgotten what they're talking about, what the context is.
Sure.
So, I mean, you want to keep it vague enough, like the Twilight Zone. You know, issues that Rod Serling wrote about in the 1950s and early 60s are still applicable today. You don't want to box yourself into a corner where you are just doing topical stuff, because the topics change day to day in this in this century. So yeah, I thought it was, you know, you could apply it to almost any issue, really. I mean, any kind of, you know, mainstream issue that's in the news. That way you walk out of the theater or you walk out of the living room with your own interpretation. Like, hey, they were talking about that, and I saw that on the news the other night. I thought it was, you know, it was a really good, interesting effort.
Yeah. So overall, maybe not totally your cup of tea, but fans of the genre might have a good time.
Yes, fans of the genre will enjoy it. People like me who are not fans will enjoy, if nothing else, an interesting and compelling 2+ hours.
Yeah, and I'd say the cast is great. Joss Whedon's doing great work, though I know he's not going to be on the next one, which is something of a bummer. And I like to see him as a director pushing himself, but I did feel maybe a little bit overstuffed upon reflection and reviewing some of the other Marvel movies in preparation for this review. But still a lot of fun.
He's come a long way.
Yes.
I mean, that's amazing. His story is, I mean, that might be worth talking about on one of these shows. His story is just where he came from and what he did years ago in television. He's really come a long way, and he's paved his way to you know, worldwide success.
Maybe we'll do a top 3 of TV to film transitions.
Sure.
And, you know, speaking of top 3s, up next we're going to be thinking about our top 3 robot movies. The robot, of course, is a villain in this film. We'll see if James Spader's Ultron, as he's called, makes the cut for any of us. Coming right up after this. So welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to Movie Time, where we've been talking about Avengers 2, the new big-budget superhero thriller. Now, this is a film that featured a robot as the villain, so we were thinking, let's cast the net a bit wider and think about our top 3 robot movies. Now, a couple ground rules, right?
Right.
Cyborg, robot, I don't know the distinction. So what we talk about might not quite fit your criteria of a robot, but why don't we start off with your number 3? And
my number 3 is RoboCop, and I'll tell you why. There's something about dystopia I love. I'm a sci-fi nerd. I love a good, anytime you can kind of talk about the future and you paint this bleak picture, and kind of in the end, everything turns out for the better. I love that. Yeah. First of all, it's an easy story to tell. RoboCop, for those who don't remember, he was a cop in Detroit, and he was killed by a gang. And this takes place, I don't remember what year it was supposed to be.
Near future.
Near future. So they never really say what year it is. So it could be tomorrow. But this company turns this dead police officer into a robot.
Yeah.
Into this, you know, kick-ass crime-fighting robot. Can I say that?
I think it's okay for now.
All right. And it's, you know, it's great. You know, they did a sequel and then a sequel to the sequel. But the original, I think, stands out as the best in a real niche genre. There aren't very many, you know, robot crime fighters to compete against.
It's a good point.
But I would say Robot would be my number 3 choice.
RoboCop.
RoboCop. What did I say?
Robot.
Robot.
That might be a movie.
That's a 4th version.
So I'm going to cheat actually with my number 3. I know we just started the show, I'm already cheating. But I think when you think about this, it'll make sense. So 2 movies that are a bit flawed in my book, but have outstanding introductions. The first being Wall-E, and the second being Prometheus.
Wow.
So Wall-E's first 15 minutes, the Pixar film where the little robot's cleaning up garbage and then he goes into space, right? So when he goes into space, it's fun, but it's not perfect. I think the first 15 minutes when it's just him and the other robot comes and he falls in love is some of the best filmmaking I've ever seen.
Right.
Just perfectly done, articulated images, the use of music, the use of the shots, beautiful. And this idea that he's also learning what it means to be human to the extent that he wants to.
Yeah.
All through love with the little robot Eva, but also watching old movies and musicals and playing with the toys that we've thrown off now that we're in space. So I think that's really good. But Prometheus seems different. Ridley Scott's film from, I want to say, 2013. And it begins with Michael Fassbender, who plays a cyborg. And we know he's a cyborg. Mm-hmm. But it's also this montage of an introduction of a character alone. I think he's on a spaceship. And he's learning also how to be human. He's playing basketball with himself. He's watching Peter O'Toole films.
Of course. And
I find it interesting that in both cases, really well done in both cases, Michael Fassbender's a great actor, Wall-E's a great actor, that it's not enjoying robotic type stuff, it's them learning how to be human. I think that's an interesting through line with a lot of these films, and they do it pretty well.
All right.
You're number 2.
Terminator.
Okay.
This is, in my defense, as I'm not a big Arnold Schwarzenegger fan, but I remember going with, I think my dad took me to the original Terminator that came out in 91?
Could be.
92, early 90s, or maybe mid-90s. It was a long time ago. And that, I would argue that the original Terminator film allowed for all of these other films to be made. That really, even though robots had been used in films prior to Terminator, this really opened the floodgates to the big budget robot sci-fi film.
Transformers and the like.
Exactly. I mean, without, and it gave us a lot of catchphrases that we still use in the year 2015. I still think that Terminator set the trend for every similar film that's come down the pike since then.
Yeah, James Cameron does a really good job there. Terminator 2 is pretty good too.
And I forget that it was a James Cameron film, and that was even before Titanic.
Right.
Which will probably be best remembered for.
Yeah, true. So my number 2, I'm thinking about 2001. And now I realize that Hal is a computer, but he is something of a robot. Yeah. And it kind of follows that through line I've been thinking about where he's attempting to be a bit human. But in the same way that Ultron, decides I have to eliminate people to achieve the goal, he gets this sort of homicidal view, and this is about in the middle of the film, so we're not spoiling too much. But, speaking of setting the tone for big blockbuster, right, it seems to me that when you look at Hal, it's setting the tone for that steely, cool, psychopathic, computer robot model that we've been following ever since. And the fact that it's just one red eye, but he's also vulnerable from, pulling out a microchip or pulling out a wire. I think it's really neat that he's so omniscient in some ways and yet so vulnerable. Nice extension of sort of what it means to be human. You're extending the extremes. And I thought that was a pretty great film in general, Kubrick, but a really interesting stepping stone for robots and movies.
I never would have thought about that choice. That's a good call.
Yeah.
My number 1.
Right.
From the 1950s.
Okay.
We're going back quite a ways here. The Day the Earth Stood Still. We talked about Terminator and how that kind of ushered in the era of the big budget blockbuster sci-fi movie. If you think about it, if you go back to the 50s, The Day the Earth Stood Still really ushered in the whole sci-fi movement. I mean, if you were to take that out of the equation, we probably wouldn't have things like Transformers and movies along those lines. It's a classic. I don't know how else to describe it. It's, it came from the era of the B movie.
Right.
It was very similar to movies that came out around the same time, but it's a classic. It is an instant classic.
Excellent.
I don't know if it was meant to be a classic.
Yeah.
But in the annals of film history, it certainly is.
Excellent. Terrific. Yeah.
What's your number 1?
Well, I'm going to continue the idea of robot movies that sort of push the boundary between what is real and what's robotic, how humanity interacts with these things, with Ridley Scott's 80s movie, Blade Runner.
Oh.
So Blade Runner has Harrison Ford as this police officer who's hunting down robots that seem so real, everyone assumes they're human. Obviously, we can't have those kind of people running around. And what's interesting about the film is it starts with this test. And he's running a test on a man who may be a robot, may not be. He has no idea, but the test might prove it through questions and emotional triggers and things. I think it's an amazing movie, though, because along with being a great film about robots, it's also just an amazing view of what society can be when that sort of level of artificiality takes over. Now, a lot of people believe that maybe even Harrison Ford's character is a robot. The film's gone through 4 different cuts. Ridley Scott finally released his final cut a few years ago. And this debate goes on throughout the different editions. Is he one? Is he not? I think it kind of misses the point, right? The film is about when society becomes artificial, when we're able to create something that's as human, if not better than human. Mm-hmm. Really, what happens to society as well as the people in power? Right? Harrison Ford is this sort of noir, Bogart kind of detective, but at the same time he's got some demons he's working through. And the whole package is very complicated, but it's sort of surrounding this idea of robots and sort of what they mean when we think about holding up a mirror to ourselves.
That's a pretty interesting interpretation. I wonder how many people who've seen the film would have looked at it the same way.
Well, hopefully they'll take another look.
Hopefully they will.
Yeah.
So that's your number 1.
That's my number 1.
All right. That brings to an end to this program. We thank you very much for watching. And don't forget, you too can host a television show on Auburn Regional Media Access. To do that, to learn more, go to our website, ARMA.org. And don't forget to like ARMA on Facebook.
Absolutely.
It's a very simple process. If you have Facebook, if you don't have Facebook, then it's not simple at all. But it's pretty simple to sign up for Facebook.
And we'll also say, if you're interested in hosting or co-hosting or co-reviewing a film on an upcoming show, we'd love to have a guest.
Absolutely. You can be a part of this very fine television production. For Mike Reiff, I'm Joe Salzone. We'll see you at the movies.